Thank you for that question. I think it's a good place to start, and I'm going to start by zooming back a little bit to address the notion of inequality. And I'm reminded by a story by David Foster Wallace. He used it in a commencement speech, actually, and it goes like this. Maybe you've heard it. There are these two fish, and they're swimming along, and they come across this older fish, and the older fish looks at them and says, "Hey, how's the water?" And the two fish sort of look at each other, and they shrug the way that fishes do, and they go on swimming. And then the one looks at the other and says, "What the heck is water?" And to me, that captures perhaps what Brecht knew, that what is invisible only becomes visible when we have distance from it, when what is so familiar and taken for granted becomes unfamiliar, strange, alien to us, so that we can gain new perspective. And to me, that's the same with culture, the fluid, day-to-day realities that we live in specific context. Culture is best revealed when it is embodied, when it is enacted, when it is performed, when it is made visible through performance. And it is already made visible through performance. Our day-to-day performances with each other, the ordinary kind of performance, and then the extraordinary kind of performance that we repeat on stage or that we repeat on the street, that we intentionally construct in order to make the invisible visible. So when I think about my work, I think about revealing a culture of inequality, a culture in which, for the most part, we've managed to tolerate living in buildings, for example, that privilege people who have full physical and psychological capacity over those who might not. We tolerate realities where a woman can still earn 81 cents to the dollar in the US, and that figure changes to 54 cents to 62 around if you're a woman of color, of Latinx or indigenous background, or if you're Black. Or we tend to tolerate a certain threshold of loss of life if you're a person of color in the country that I live in right now, although I know white supremacy is a global pandemic as well. And so staging these realities is a way of making them visible, as I mentioned. Staging these stories is a way of making them visceral as well, and holding each other accountable, because we're in it. We're in the same room, in the same space and time, contending with this reality. There are a few different examples that I could draw on. Um, in 2011, we staged a performance at NYU called Race as Performance, which is, in a way, the most direct example of what I was just speaking to, in the sense that we were taking this social construct of race and making it visible through performance. How does race reveal itself, and how does racialization and racism reveal itself in our interactions? It was a autoethnographic performance staged by five people who had lived through different experiences as a result of their Black identity, Jewish identity, white passing identities. So they told their stories on stage, specific stories where they came to understand something about their racial identity. So that's one example, using a kind of ethnographic approach. A couple of years ago, in my capacity as director of the program in drama therapy at NYU, I produced a performance that was led by another faculty member, Britton Williams, called Turbulence, which was a devised performance piece in which a group of students and alumni came together to reflect on their own experiences of the same and create theater from those stories, more of a sociobiographical piece, so that in the end, the story is not any one person's in particular, but presents a collage, a composite of experiences, which was transformative for them in the sense that it formed community and it formed alliances within the group, which already, in my mind, serves to advance racial justice and healing, because you're creating a network where there wasn't one prior. And that network makes it possible for people to remain resilient and in this struggle a little bit longer. I'll give you another example, which is using playback theater to work with faculty and staff in a university. At another university that where I worked, we used playback theater as a means of opening up a dialogue as to how racism is revealed in faculty relationships, in staff relationships within an institution of higher education. And most recently, we have decided to produce 5 one-act plays by the playwright Idris Goodwin as part of a more recent effort to stay with this cause through performance. This is a great question. So we have this opportunity when we stage work to not only cast our actors, right? Not only cast the ensemble, but also to cast the audience, to really think about who do we want to have see this. Autoethnographic performance piece, it was seen, by friends, by family, but also the broader public. Could be an audience of one or, sort of a limited audience of, 5 at a time to experience more intimacy and more proximity in the work. When we think about the construction of a theater, and I know that performance, our theater making work can take place anywhere and everywhere. It's not limited to the specific buildings that we call theaters. However, if we work within a space where we have the capacity to change the architecture, where we have the opportunity to direct light, and where we have the opportunity to amplify sound, what we're effectively doing is calling attention to an issue, calling attention to a group of people, where everything in that space is architectured to invite you to look in a specific direction and to have a shared experience. And so my hope was for exactly that, for us to have an experience together where the performance is not only happening on stage, but the audience is performing their attention, not performing in a trite sense, in a superficial sense, but are really there to attend for that space and time to issues concerning race and racism, in New York, in our country, and so forth. So the potential in that space is one that is experienced both for the actors, because they're staging stories that are dear to them, and that in the act of performance might discover something new about that particular story and gain a different perspective on it. And for the audience, who has an opportunity to reflect on an issue for that space and time, conversation as well. And we often do that after a performance, open up a space to have a conversation. In fact, the more I do this work, the more I realize you actually need very little performative catalyst for a rich conversation. It doesn't have to be a very long play at all. Like, there were members of the audience that raised their hand and said, "Me too." Yes, that is also like my experience. And the fact that you have taken the space and time to share your story gives me courage to share my own. That's often a response that we'll receive to this kind of performance, which is powerful, which is necessary. There will also be, as the conversation unfolds, opportunity to raise, where there's something at stake. So where is this issue showing up now in people's lives, in their work lives, in their social lives, in their family lives? If we break up the post-performance environment further and invite people to have small group conversations or engage in some, artistic reflection, then of course we would discover other nuances to what they're experiencing. But to come back to your question, I know that there were audience members who said, yes, this is like my experience, and there were other audience members who listened. Maybe I'll start with the last question first, which is to say that containing the conversation or giving it a boundary, um, to me, is about letting the audience know what to expect to some degree, so that when they're invited into a performance, they're invited into a performance and conversation. So right from the gathering, performance, and dispersal phases of an event, there is an acknowledgement that the space will include a space for reflection, to share your reflections, or to listen to others reflect. It's an optional space. However, it's one that is intentionally created and that we're letting you in on, that we're letting you know that this is going to be happening. And then to further give it shape and uh, invite the fullest expression we can without it sort of exceeding the boundaries of what we can hold. We'll use specific questions, try to keep the directive really clear. Sometimes it's helpful to, if it's a particularly evocative performance, to take a moment and just say, invite the entire audience who has been sharing the experience of the performance, maybe sharing it differently, individually, uniquely, but still shared in the sense that we're all in the same space and time together, to take a breath, together. Some people find it easier to reflect in pairs before we open it up to the larger group. So variations on strategies like that. Taking a pause and coming back and moving into another theatrical form like playback theater has been another strategy I've used to facilitate post-performance work. But otherwise, it can be as simple as, small group and large group conversation. Another strategy has been to actually set a seat up on the stage, right, where we're inviting somebody just to come up and share how they related to the performance. And by creating a ritual space, an invitation to come and sit there, we elevate the audience's story as well. There are many strategies we could talk about in terms of post-performance. Those are a few. In terms of what's feasible with the liveness of theater versus a recorded performance, or an otherwise mediated performance, I think I'll reflect back to what I mentioned earlier, which is that there's this visceral liveness that is communicated in live performance. But another human being who is enacting, who is laboring in this artful way to communicate something to you of life as it was, or as it is, or as it could be. And it's harder to walk away from, maybe because the theater's complicated to get out of, but also it's harder to walk away from a live performance. We have the luxury of being in the same space, then we have a tangible connection with one another. And my work has not always taken place on proscenium stages either, and so sometimes we really are close up and in person with whoever is charged with enacting something intentionally. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, we're performing our interactions all the time in daily life. But the way that the performance is set up will invite different configurations of that. The stage isn't always elevated, it isn't always set apart. And so, one can feel that visceral connection more deeply, to varying degrees depending on how we use space. Is the audience seated, or are they mobile? Are they able to maneuver in and around the actors, in and around different scenes? One of the most powerful performances that I personally experienced was in Germany, and it was a group from Belgium that had performed a piece called You. And they invited one audience member at a time to walk in. Sorry, it was called A Game of You. Even more mysterious, A Game of You. So you walked into a dark room, were led down a small corridor, sat in a small room with a mirror, and then somebody came and sat next to you, presumably another audience member, and they engaged in some conversation about whether this was the first time I'd seen the play. And I said, you know, it's the first time. I've never experienced anything like this before. And then a curtain opened leading to another long hallway where I was greeted by somebody else who, you know, the long and the short of it is that it was a very intimate, individualized performance that I can still feel and that I can still remember. And that's what I'm getting at when I talk about visceral change, is that it's memorable. We retain it. We retain it in our because we've taken it in with our being, with our senses, and it's not like a paper I've read on racism, like something I've experienced that has been transformative in terms of how I view the other or how I view myself. Well, I'll give you a more recent example. So I'll give you an example from yesterday. We held a stage reading of 5 one-act plays written by Idris Goodwin on the topic of race. They're they range from plays of 7 to 8 minutes to 14, 15 minutes, each locating the experience of racism within an interaction between two or more people. Sometimes two people of color negotiating what it is uh, to consider what it means to be free. Sometimes, or another one of the plays is placed in a college dorm room where a roommate is interested in preserving her own history and hangs up a Confederate flag. Her roommate's black, and they have a negotiation around what this means to have a flag that represents such a hateful and violent history against people of color, hanging in the same room. So we're in a time of the pandemic. These plays could not be staged live with people in the room. So the reading, and we know that the performance will be staged in this environment on Zoom. And so the experience of liveness changes. Yes, we might be performing in the same space and time. Well, not the same time, because Zoom, one of the benefits is, of course, we are able to engage people across borders and across time zones. But it is live. It's still happening live. At least that's our plan with this particular series. So last night we held a reading, an invited reading for these 5 plays, and each one of them was jarring. I had read the plays before, workshopped them a bit with our production team, our artistic director Adam Stevens, and our production team. But to see them all strung together with the invited audience for the reading created this tension that was palpable. It was just a palpable tension because each of them speaks to such a severe history of violence, but it is captured in the language of a 6-year-old and her grandmother, or 2 college students, or three adults who are considering what it means to be free. And each snapshot is a moment that audience members can relate to differently, either because they themselves have lived something like that directly, or they have been complicit in either noticing it and ignoring it, or trying to interrupt it, perhaps. And the reading was followed by affinity groups. So people who identified as people of color went into a breakout room, and white allies went into another breakout room, and they discussed what the experience was like to bear witness to the reading, any aesthetic considerations that they would offer, and of course, a consideration as to who else needs to see this play. So it's a work in progress right now, but it's one that I know, is going to have some impact, because it, even from the reading, already has a ripple effect that I can feel. So this particular project arose from a new repertory theater that we launched this past year. And it's a repertory theater with a mission to advance racial justice and healing through performance. And it does that by producing the work of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, persons of color playwrights.
Mm-hmm.
And it does so by forming affinity groups between students and alumni and community members. And it locates this performative work within a social struggle, a social movement. And that social movement has been not, even though we may claim solidarity, it's really important for us to complicate that solidarity, for us to examine what is at stake for people of color in this fight against white supremacy, and what is at stake for people who are white or white passing. And so taking the time to separate out into these groups offers a space to give dedicated attention to that issue, rather than assuming solidarity only to find that we are repeating and remaining in this struggle 400 years since slavery in this particular country, anyway. So it offers space and time to be able to resource oneself, to check out one's perspective, and also to complicate the alliances between BIPOC identifying folks as well. I mean, you could certainly break that down further, because there are a lot of issues to work out between people of color, people who identify as Black, people who are Indigenous. We have different histories, um, and what is at stake will be different for each of us. So there's a necessity for affinity groups, and there's a necessity for shared groups, for shared spaces. Often use audience feedback forms.
Mm-hmm.
We don't often get a great return rate on them, but when we've held a intentional focus group for people who've attended a performance that we've done, and we'll get a group of people that are already interested in sharing what that was for them. We've certainly have qualitative and anecdotal evidence to support the kind of change that we are observing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there are even more sophisticated ways of measuring audience impact, um, that that I'm getting more and more interested in. Although I will say that it's for well, I'll say for example, there's a study that was done at the University College in London that indicated that audience members will experience um, heart like a shift in their heart rate variability when they're watching a performance together. Their hearts will start to beat around the same time. They will share a certain rhythm with one another. Now, what does that mean in terms of our capacity to coexist? I don't know, and I don't know that they know. So when I speak about more sophisticated ways of measuring audience impact, I think that we're at the beginning in terms of looking at the impact of the arts in general. There's a lot of interest in this area in terms of how the arts contribute to health and well-being. And certainly I'm interested in how improvisation and drama and performance and everything that goes into theater making contributes to our health and well-being across the lifespan. But we have some ways to go to be able to connect the dots between, all right, so our heart rates are syncing up. How does that correlate with this other data that helps us understand whether that's of value to us, and what does it mean? So there's some work to do yet. It's good. You don't want to peak too soon. We have some work to do. Sure. So, playback theater is a form of oral history and performance that was developed by Jonathan Fox and Joe Salas in the mid 1970s. And it involves a group of actors spontaneously reflecting the stories of an audience. It starts with short forms and it leads to longer forms. The ritual is held by a conductor, and there's often a musician. And so every performance is new. You don't know what's going to happen. Although the forms may repeat themselves, the stories are always new. I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts at the time, and you know, playback theater is a form that's really spread all over the world. And so it wasn't a surprise to me that there was a playback theater company not too far from where I lived, very close, in fact. And I was able to get to know them and to draw on them to create a pickup team to be able to bear witness to and listen to stories of faculty and staff members at the university where I was working. In order to even get to that point, though, there had to be some trust built within that institution. So they had to know a bit about my work, and they had to get to know me, and so that when I made this proposal to our dean in our school, and I worked with another colleague who was working in the education school. When we proposed this project, it could be met with some confidence. Challenging in any workplace environment to ask people to be more vulnerable. We actually work at compartmentalizing our lives to some extent so that we can do the work. And one could argue that no, a better workplace culture might be where we're able to lean on each other with more of what's going on in our lives, and that may well be. I'm a believer in that. I'm not sure that everybody's a believer in that, and I also believe in a healthy work-life separation. I think some compartmentalization is useful. However, when it comes to the violence of racism and the insidiousness of a culture of white supremacy, I know and I believe that we have a shared responsibility in uprooting it and revealing where it shows up. So those who said yes to the project shared that belief to some extent. So we pulled together this pickup team and we staged two performances, one for the Graduate School of Education and one for the Graduate School of Arts and Social Sciences. And, both performances um, created spaces where we heard stories of how racism shows up in the classroom. So, a professor observing an interaction between students, or having a conversation with a student and then realizing how they may have sounded, and how what they were saying could be interpreted as I'm second guessing you, and I don't believe you have the qualifications to know what you're speaking about, or engaging in some form of microaggression that wasn't intended but has happened and therefore needs to be worked through, and the challenge and the awkwardness of that at times. By creating a space where people were able to share more of these stories, there were a couple of things that occurred. One, it became more, we were able to create more of an environment where one could actually reach out to a colleague and say, this is what's happening, or this just happened in my class. And because we had lived through this experience together, there was a bit more of an expectation that we would have some similar language or some context, some shared experience to be able to draw on, to be able to continue the kind of mutual aid that I think a playback theater performance represents. That we're sharing our stories as a means of guiding us forward as a community. Not everybody loved it, right? Some people found it too vulnerable, and that they found themselves telling stories that they later worried about. They later worried, the environment was so conducive to storytelling. I told this story, and now I'm wondering if people see me differently. That was the sort of immediate day after effect. Now, I will say that later on, nothing bad happened, and I'm not sure if they would do it again, but that they did indicate that that their fears were not founded. There wasn't anything bad that happened as a result of telling this story. But the fact of the matter is that it did leave them feeling a bit raw in some cases, and in other cases, empowered and able to have these conversations with colleagues in ways that they weren't able to before. Well, we did document the project, and so we do have that as a resource to share. And it's really important that the playback theater team has done their work to exchange stories of how race and racism emerges in their life and is revealed in their life, so that they have one, they're aware of their own biases, and because it's an art form that relies on spontaneous associations, it's very easy. And of course, we draw on our own associations and experiences all the time. But the art of it is also about decentering from that space in order to really accommodate the story of the other. And ultimately, what one produces on stage is a mix of the two. It's a composite of my experience and your experience, as much as possible leaning towards your experience. But I'm still drawing on my gestural repertoire and my emotional repertoire. And so in order to exercise that repertoire, we've got to be in a good rehearsal around these issues. And it's really important, especially around a performance attending to race and racism, that you've got a diverse team. You've got to have a team that represents, one, the community that you're working with, but also that is coming from different lived experiences. I think you can't have a playback theater company that's all white, for example, unless you can have a playback company that's all white. You certainly can, and you can work with white allies and white groups and say, how are we as white people engaging in uprooting racism? And let's have a conversation about that. But I think it's really important, if you're going to work in mixed groups, that your company reflects the communities that you're in. Playback theater involves a ritual. And that ritual is revealed to the audience as soon as the actors walk on stage. You have actors, you have a conductor who serves as like the master of ceremonies, the conduit between the audience and the stage. You have a musician or a group of musicians, and you have the audience. And the conductor will typically invite the actors to introduce themselves, or the team will introduce themselves in some way. And right from the beginning, the actors are introducing themselves with an experience that connects to the themes of the performance. Sometimes a playback performance is open, and sometimes it's thematic. And if it's intended to explore issues of racism, then it's a thematic performance, and the actors are going to introduce themselves with some anecdote of how they themselves have encountered racism or been complicit in it, participated in it, ignored it. Some variation on the theme. And it's important, again, for there to be variation, because right from the beginning, then, the audience has multiple points of identification, right? They're already meditating and sitting with, who do they relate to? Who are they warmed up to? What stories are being awoken in them right from that introduction sequence? Continuing in that ritual, the conductor will turn to the audience and invite somebody to share what brought them, a question that they can easily answer, but will probably be influenced a little bit by that introduction sequence. And right from there, the conversation, this artful conversation that takes place in playback, begins. happening there is what happens in the arts overall, which is that you're inviting somebody to share their lived experience, and then it's like you're pressing the pause button, and there's this symbolic representation of that experience that's offered. And in the making of that experience, the audience is invited into a kind of trance-like state for some of them. This may not happen for everybody, but there's an opportunity to meditate on the symbols that are unfolding, on the images that are being constructed by the actors, sometimes with the use of scarves and, colored fabrics that we use in playback, and sometimes not, just with their bodies. And in that moment, it's a bit like a contemplative practice. You're sitting with that story a little bit longer. You're not moving right to the next topic. The conversation is slowed down, right? The dialogue is slowed down, which to me contributes to, one, the holding the ritual overall and what can be expected in this space, right? The audience comes to learn what they can expect of this space, that when I share something, there's going to be a pause. The actors are going to reflect on it, and we're going to sit with it for a little bit. And then the conductor is going to turn to me and say, is there anything else you'd like to say about this experience, or some variation on that? So the art in the conversation invites greater contemplation, and it takes complex experiences and, to me, maintains their complexity. Doesn't try to reduce them. It holds the complexity of them. And, I think this is why we take comfort in a great poem, or a painting that grips us, because there's something about it that captures the complexity of our experience that words or numbers cannot capture alone, or, right, that just, a descriptive account couldn't capture alone, or it needs to be through the art form that we maintain the richness of that lived experience. This last project that I was telling you about with the with free play, the 5 1 acts on race, um, it has global implications. One, because of the medium that we're using. So audience members and actors are able to join from all over the world, right? So there's this reach that's possible because of the medium. Of course, there's something lost, right? We know what's lost. The embodied encounter in the same space is not possible, but something else is possible. But if we were talking about, the before time, before COVID, and perhaps what we might hope to return to again, if you imagine, that every audience member is an archive, is a library of stories, and they are taking in the experience of that particular performance, and they are leaving and they are meeting with their loved ones and their family members. And if it's anything like the theater that I've experienced that stayed with me, I'm going to talk about it. I'm going to bring somebody to it. I'm going to share it. And I may not share the narrative arc of the performance. I might share how I have been changed. Or I might share the story that was awoken in me because of the performance. So in that way, it spreads. Can we account for that? Not without a really careful longitudinal study. And I'm less interested in that. I don't have the resources to follow people around outside the theater for very long. But I can account for what happens in that space and time, and the affect that is generated, and to hope that that affect leads to effect in a global sense. We would all hope for that, I think, as artists and as healers.